Thank you, and good afternoon to you all, and thank you for attending this talk today. Again, my name is Kevin Mercer. I'm currently Assistant Professor of Digital Media Arts and Animation at Southern Illinois University in the US. My talk today is titled The Socio-Spatial Currencies of Dark Souls and Death Stranding. Video games such as Dark Souls and Death Stranding feature asynchronously shared virtual spaces in which the player's understanding, navigation, and alterations of the in-game architecture and landscape are made possible with the transaction of social currencies. Though purely digital, these game worlds are socio-spatial, informed by geographically dispersed yet virtually close inhabitants, each seeking to triumph over and care for those worlds. I'll begin today by outlining both games, discussing their respective genres, settings, aesthetics, and themes. I'll then compare their in-game economies, both those founded on typical monetary transactions and those fueled by more social interactions. I'll then end with some specific illustrations of asynchronous online interactions, which give shape to so-called socio-spatial currencies. We'll begin with Dark Souls, a famously difficult third-person action RPG developed by From Software under the direction of Hidetaka Miyazaki. So in this game, treacherous labyrinthian environments are explored incrementally during cycles of the player's life and death. Progress requires venturing beyond the safety of a bonfire checkpoint, many in fact, one is pictured here, into ruins, cathedrals, and hamlets replete with vicious enemies and unseen traps. By comparison, Death Stranding, which was developed by Kojima Productions under the direction of Hideo Kojima and released in 2019, the player embodies a porter tasked with transporting resources and rebuilding the infrastructure of a post-apocalyptic United States. The gameplay loop sees the protagonist traversing really extreme and dangerous landscapes, seeking many natural paths, but also constructing roads and bridges along the way. So at first blush, these seem like two very unlikely games to be put into conversation with one another. In Dark Souls, we're in a fictional medieval city called Lordran, so we can expect dragons and knights and magic and things of that sort. With Death Stranding, it takes place in a near futuristic US, and it features a lot of advanced technologies, such as rapidly prototyped robotics. But these aesthetics aside, there are many mechanical differences as well. In Dark Souls, on the left, we have near constant and frequently very frustrating combat versus this sort of slow, meandering play style with intermittent combat in Death Stranding. Dark Souls has one large interconnected play space that feels sort of cellular that the player navigates, whereas Death Stranding features a suite of large sort of sandbox-style environments. Dark Souls has no maps or a compass whatsoever, so the play space really has to be internalized by the player, whereas Death Stranding features many maps that can be pinned and notated, as well as a very useful and informative navigational heads-up display. But I want to talk too about what they share in common. So both games really evoke the Kantian sublime, which is to say that the beauty and the power of the natural world are sort of at the forefront. The immense scale of the landscapes, and their beauty as well, beckon the player forward to really explore and engage with those worlds. But they're so large and so dangerous that they remind the player of their own mortality. In addition to being populated with enemies, the worlds themselves are dangerous. It's not uncommon to fall off a cliff in Dark Souls or take a tumble in Death Stranding, if anyone has played either of these titles. Both of the worlds are subject to supernatural disasters that blur realms or realities. Darkness really kind of bleeds into both worlds. Dark Souls is a world in which those in political power seek to subjugate and force the labor of the populace. And the player is asked to align with particular factions known as covens in Dark Souls in order to topple a regime of sorts. Death Stranding is set against a fractured and disorganized United States, and the player is called to action by the president, who is actually terminally ill, in order to reconnect dispersed groups. In both games, the player is tasked with perhaps the most primal stakes offered by a video game story, and that is to save humanity from extinction. They both penalize death in unique and similar ways. In Dark Souls, the player becomes an undead or hollow version of themselves. Reversing this hollowing requires a consumable item known as humanity, which then enables online interactions and increased access to healing items. So yes, a transaction of humanity must take place in order to compensate for a death and to regain access to one's sort of physical body. In Death Stranding, death whisks the player away into an underwater afterlife, uncoupling their digital spirit and body, forcing them to swim as a spirit back into their body in a process the game calls repatriation. Both titles feature asynchronous online interactions, which are curious design choices in an era where most gamers have come to expect synchronous competitive play with others around the globe. As we'll see soon, these asynchronous systems support unique in-game economies. The economy of Dark Souls is pretty simple in that the player is rewarded with a currency called souls when defeating enemies. The player can then use these to level up and enhance their stats, or spend them with merchants to gain items or even learn magic. Ultimately, the big risk is that they'll lose them upon death and have to regain them. And all of this is pretty standard in that the player earns some money and then they spend it in exchange for an item, modeling a typical transaction that we might see in the real world. As you can see in this slide, the player is about to purchase about 700 arrows for nearly 2,200 souls. That I think we've not seen that in the real world, but Death Stranding is a little bit more complicated though. The economy does not require just one single currency. It actually requires crafting materials. So rather than purchasing items outright, a variety of resources must be pooled, such as metals and resins and chemicals. And in both of these titles, Dark Souls and Death Stranding, at least a modest amount of grinding is really necessary in order to acquire or craft the most useful gear. And this is a step deeper than the economy of Dark Souls in that the player is given more types of currency to track and earn, but it is still based on straightforward transactions. And here are two examples of usable in-game items that illustrate how closely the economies are linked to digital notions of the self. On the left is the soul of a seasoned warrior. And that's a consumable item in Dark Souls that yields a large amount of currency upon use. There are multiple versions of this item, and the grander the language in describing the soul, the higher the yield. So a discrete value is assigned to the particular merits of a fallen soldier. So the better they are at serving the state, more can be purchased with their soul. On the right is the hematic grenade, which is a weapon in Death Stranding that atomizes the avatar's blood to combat otherworldly enemies. In addition to blood, the avatar's urine, fecal matter, and dirty shower water can become raw materials for the development of other weapons and tools. In the arts, artifacts, and artifices of identity, Elliot Oring compares previous generations of humanity apt to be defined more by what they produce and contribute to society against postmodern humans, stating, postmodern man is product-directed, known by what he does and does not consume. It's curious to me how these two usable items from video games reflect a strange conflation of economy and identity, where some of the most powerful commodities are developed and purchased through the consumption of body and spirit. These games in tandem illustrate profound spiritual and physical violence perpetrated by capitalism. Now that I've discussed these two games and laid the groundwork of their in-game economies, I'd like to delve further into the social interactions that give shape to secondary economies. We'll begin with Dark Souls. And I want to note that while Dark Souls does have some synchronous online mechanics, I'm focusing specifically on asynchronous mechanics. The first of which is the messaging system. Shown top right is a cryptic message scrawled on the ground with an item called the Orange Guidance Soapstone. This item allows players to draft short messages and leave them in the world to be found by unknown players sharing the same server. When drafting, the player is not given a keyboard to type anything they like. It actually just lists categories of words from which the player can choose to assemble a message quickly. Shown bottom left is a player viewing a message that reads imminent Drake. And this one isn't a very helpful message because we can see the Drake at the end of the bridge there, but it is kind of funny. And there are many of these in Dark Souls and other Souls-likes where the messages are not necessarily meant for the edification of the player, but maybe for a chuckle instead. This is our first socio-spatial currency, commenting in a three-dimensional message board that is the game world. And it's important to keep in mind that players cannot know the names of the authors who made these messages, and they cannot respond with a message in kind. These are one-way communications. And as you may have guessed, while there are a lot of good-natured players in the world of Dark Souls, there are many that are also ready to troll players and leave lies or misleading information. But when the player finds a message like this one here, they can then appraise it. So they can assign it as good +1 or bad -1. And as these appraisals accumulate, the message's validity can be more or less discerned. So if we've got a very high number in the positive range, it's probably true. If it's mostly negative, it's likely false. In this example, the message indicates that there's a ledge behind these breakable barrels, and from that ledge, we can jump down and take an alternate route or a shortcut or something like that. So this is our second socio-spatial currency, the upvoting and downvoting of comments. The messaging system in Dark Souls can be important as the player learns to navigate the game for the first time. The map is full of secrets, shortcuts, and circuitous paths. The ability to leave signposts for one another enables players to work together to unlock their surroundings. In You Died, the Dark Souls Companion by Keza MacDonald and Jason Killingsworth, they discuss the difficulties of finding their way around a new game world. So they were playing this notoriously difficult game, Dark Souls, for the first time ahead of release in order to draft reviews. So they didn't have access to the server to be able to leave each other messages like this. So they maintained an email chain that they dubbed the Chain of Pain. And in that chain, Mitch Dyer writes an email to MacDonald. 2 hours of exploring later, I've made no forward progress from the stone bridge up high, bonfire in Blighttown. I've climbed so many ladders. Where do I go? In the absence of the soapstone messaging system, which was not available to these players, this email chain highlights the necessity of social interactions in the exchange of information intrinsic to Dark Souls. And Death Stranding brings us to our third socio-spatial currency, which is likes. This image shows one player's lifetime stats in Death Stranding. It outlines things like playtime, distance traveled, manner of travel, the heights that they've ascended or descended, and the total likes they've been awarded. You can see here that likes can be awarded by both NPCs, non-player characters, and real-world players. Similar to Dark Souls, these players are largely unknown to one another, but can evaluate each other's work. This player has received nearly 50,000 likes from other real people playing the game. And for context, that's quite a lot. According to this, they've played for about 72 hours. That's a fair number of likes. They've made a lot of contributions to the world. Each of the 5 points on the star on the left here correlate with specific stats important to the player's progress. So, and most of them are related to cargo delivery. Remember, this is a porter delivering things across the fractured United States. So things like delivery volume, the condition of those deliveries, and the time it took to make those deliveries are all really important to player progression. Likes are awarded for different types of activities, and perhaps the most important of these being the placement and construction of tools and architecture throughout a shared world. Pictured here is a telescoping ladder spanning a deep stream that is cut through rocky terrain. In the approximately 40 real-time hours this player was experiencing Death Stranding, the ladder received 136 likes. Unlike objects found in most games, Death Stranding's player-placed ladders, climbing ropes, mailboxes, charging stations, and more will remain in the game until they've been removed by a player. So they can benefit many other real players over the course of gameplay. And as you may guess here, wading across this water is not really a viable option, as the player would likely be carried downstream, risking injury or damage to their cargo that they're carrying. Even worse, the cargo can become separated from the player, and if it travels far enough away from the player, it washes up in another player's version of the same game world as lost cargo. And when that player finds lost cargo that has arrived in their world, they can then decide whether to deliver it to its intended destination or entrust it to another anonymous player. They don't really have to do anything with it, but they have the option of sort of carrying out that delivery. And doing so will award them likes, but it also awards likes to the person who lost the cargo. So it is really sort of helping one another out in that way. Again, these people playing the game, they don't have any direct contact, but by lending a hand to one another, they help to collectively improve and better traverse a hostile landscape. As the player acts on the landscape, receives likes for these acts, and increases their efficacy as a socio-spatial architect, they're able to graduate from rusty ladders to paved roads and bridges like those pictured here. And players can even pool crafting materials for a common cause, like a section of road or something similar. You can see in this image as well, there are hovering cargo carriers following our player character here, which will certainly help with delivery volume. And driving up and down these roads is, of course, much easier than climbing over rocks, but these structures are only made possible through cooperation. Dr. Roel Rutten teaches in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And in his article, Beyond Proximities, he discusses the differences between geographically dispersed and geographically concentrated conversations as they relate to the development and reflection of societies. Rutten explains that conversations are not all equally connected to physical places, but he asserts that both distance and place dynamics may anchor conversations to a specific place. For example, when individuals from other places engage in the conversation through temporary proximity. In the case of both Dark Souls and Death Stranding, there are no true physical places, only virtual ones. But these temporary proximal conversations that occur, those modeled after the basis functions of social media, are primarily concerned with understanding, navigating, and surviving those virtual spaces. This image is a 3D map of Lordran, the fictional city that we navigate in Dark Souls, and it was generated by a fan who looked even further than the in-game communications in order to share spatial knowledge. And those of you in the room online who may have played Dark Souls may be struggling to find Firelink Shrine here. I don't know, but it's there. An anchored interaction brought on by temporary proximity, okay, if we're looking back to Rutten, is exactly what inspired Miyazaki's first iteration of Dark Souls online interactions. In a 2010 interview with Eurogamer, later republished in You Died, he shares the origin of that idea is actually due to a personal experience where a car suddenly stopped on a hillside after some heavy snow and started to slip. The car following me also got stuck, and then the one behind it spontaneously bumped into it and now started pushing up the hill. That's it. That's how everyone can get home. Then it was my turn, and everyone started pushing my car up the hill, and then I managed to get home safely. He continues, but I couldn't stop the car to say thanks to the people who gave me a shove. I'd have just got stuck again if I'd stopped. On the way back home, I wondered whether the last person in the line had made it home and thought that I would probably never meet the people who had helped me. I thought that maybe if we'd met in another place, we'd become friends, or maybe we'd just fight. The socio-spatial currencies of these two games are what fuel conversations that are at once geographically dispersed and concentrated. Commenting, voting, and liking boil down to the basic components of communication and cooperation, and they're critical to the primary objective of each game: explore, survive, and save the fractured and hostile worlds of Lordran and the United States. These currencies constitute secondary in-game economies that model a type of online play in which the creation and sharing of knowledge are of greater importance than neoliberal competition. To engage with each game in a manner most important to its physical environment is to participate in the subversion of their traditional economies. It costs nothing to leave a signpost in either world, and it costs nothing to read it. Ignoring these socio-spatial currencies, however, means playing an incomplete, less rich version of the game, devoid of social dynamics and proximity. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time.